Dr. Dani Sulikowski, why should an attractive woman not take advice from an equally attractive woman?
There's a lot of reasons why you might not want to do that. So women women just compete very strongly with each other. And even though there's no overall relationship between what we call mate value, which is not just how attractive a woman is, but it's how desirable she is as a mate as a whole package. And certainly for women, physical attractiveness is a big part of that. Physical appearance is a big part of mate value for men as well, but it's less about how attractive they are, if you know what I mean, and just more about other aspects of their appearance. But in any case, for women, your levels of physical attractiveness are a big component of your mate value. And so even though we don't necessarily see the most competitive women being the most attractive ones, and the least competitive women being the least attractive ones. In fact, actually, from what we can tell, there's almost no relationship between those two variables at all. You can be very competitive and very attractive, or very competitive and not very attractive. However, what we do see with intrasexual competition is that women tend to target that towards other women they perceive as being about as attractive as themselves, because that's who they perceive to be their primary rivals in the mating game. And so that's where you're going to tend to see these types of behaviours targeted most intensely. And one of the sort of, I think, best demonstrations of this that we saw was in the study that we did that many of your listeners may have heard about already, where we ostensibly sort of put women, our female participants, in a hypothetical hair salon situation. So we effectively said, look, here's a series of clients, and we showed them photos of the client so they could make their own judgments about how attractive she was. And we coupled that with photos, close-up photos of her hair, which were doctored to make it healthy or not. And we basically asked them, how much hair do you think this client should have cut off? And we coupled that with some information about the client. The bit that was most important was whether she wanted her hair kept as long as possible, or whether she was happy to have as much cut off as the hairdresser thought. And in the scenarios where the hair was really healthy, so there's no motivation to cut much off, and where the client indicated that she wanted it kept as long as possible, so cutting it off would be explicitly against her wishes, that's when we saw a relationship between self-reported intrasexual competitiveness and how much hair they advised these clients have cut off. So, and that effect, again, was the strongest when they were giving this advice to clients that they later told us they thought were about as attractive as themselves. So effectively what we had is women perceiving other women to be sort of somewhat rivals to them on a sort of mate value ladder, and attempting to sabotage these women's appearance by advising them to cut off more hair than would be necessary. And I guess the other little aside that you need in order for that to make sense is you also need to understand how much and how strongly men prefer long hair, which I think might be something that's appreciated by your male viewers, but it's something that female viewers, that I find that women are actually much less aware of than men, is that men actually have quite a strong preference for long hair over short hair. And it's interesting that, I find it interesting that even though many women I talk to don't recognise that men have a preference over long hair, yet we still see this effect. So somehow women are implicitly aware that cutting off a woman's hair is going to be damaging her mate value, even if they're not explicitly aware of this strong preference that men have.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the connection with men and the interest in long hair? Does it signal something?
Yes, definitely. So hair signals two things as far as I can tell. So one is just health. So if you've got nice, shiny, long, healthy hair, and of course the longer the hair is, the harder it is to keep it nice and shiny and healthy, and most importantly, parasite-free. So that is what most of the hair signals are. So in humans, in non-humans, in birds with their big showy feathers, a big part of that display. Now part of it is just the ability to grow. So for some birds, just the ability to grow the feathers is really important. So feather length is important. But in many cases, these types of feathers and hair, which, all sorts of little nasty bugs can colonize and enjoy living in. So being able to have this really showy display piece that is free of parasites is a really good sign that you are reasonably robust, and at least robust to the particular whatever little, collection of potential parasites there are in this current environment. So that's one thing. It's just a basic signal of health and resistance to your current health and your sort of potential resistance to disease. That explains a substantial part of the things that men find attractive in women. They're pretty much across the board. You're looking at indicators of overall physical health, indicators of fertility as well. So health is very important. There are individual differences in fertility, and that signals through hormones. Hormones change face shape, body shape. So that explains male preferences as well. But that's really the main thing. However, the other thing that hair does is not so much for men, but it actually does something for women. So the other thing that hair does is it gives, long hair, I should say, is it gives women a level of flexibility in their sexual signaling. So women will wear their hair up when they're wanting to give a sexual signal that is like not available, and they wear their hair down as a sexual signal of availability. And even if men and women are not consciously aware of this, men and women both perceive this implicitly. So if you just give men and women photos of women and you judge, how flirty is she, how both men and women will perceive hair up as like a not very approachable signal and hair down as an approachable signal. So when women are wearing their hair short, so too short to either put it up or down, you've really just got one style because of how short it is. That's also depriving women of that flexibility in their sexual signaling as well. And so that's another reason why these, in our study, we were just talking about women with ostensibly long-ish hair and how much you would cut off as a hairdresser. A separate sort of phenomenon is this idea of women sort of getting these pixie cuts and getting bob cuts and really short things. And that also is a kind of a self-sabotage sexual signal. And this is why, really attractive women can sort of get away with that because they've got lots of sexual signals available to them. They've, perhaps got a fair amount of social capital. And so a really attractive woman deciding to go for a pixie cut is, bearing a much lower cost than if she can sort of make this a little bit of a fad and then a whole bunch of less attractive women do the same thing. And for them, it's a much more costly signal. So it's like a little bit of self-sabotage in the hope that other women copy you and it hurts them much more than it hurts you. And that is the underlying principle of female fashion, by the way. That is why female clothes are, generally speaking, that the fashionable ones, whatever is like new this season, that's why they're never flattering. They're never flattering unless you're like a size 8 model who would be, flattered by a piece of string wrapped around you. Right? They're not flattering because they're designed that, women have to incur some sort of a mate value cost in order to keep up with these fashions.
Okay. So people who listen to my show regularly will understand a lot of layers of manipulation. We often talk about intensely manipulative people, psychopaths, things like that.
Yeah,
but what you're getting at in this feminized form, there are layers of inception to this kind of thing. So we've opened up a lot of different things now, but maybe let's just go back to what do you think is going on with female signaling and female competition in general? Because even the idea that females' hair would be signaling not only to men but to other women might be a good starting point. Why does that even matter with the other women?
Okay, so most of what women do in terms of their physical appearance, whether we're talking about hair, and this sort of includes not just whether you're wearing it up or down, which is sort of a universally recognized signal, but it includes other sort of more fancy get-up hairdos that the women do with their hair that men tend not to appreciate, to be honest. It can take a lot of time to do some of those fancy things, and men, you're lucky if they notice. But it's sort of, you see similar things with cosmetics and with clothing and things like that. It has a much more of the desired effect on other women than it necessarily does on men. So with makeup and cosmetics, for example, that's one area in which we sort of looked at this specifically. One thing that we have shown, and this was with a PhD student of mine, and so her thesis is out there and published, but the individual paper with this chapter in it is not yet. But what she showed is that we took photos of women and we added makeup to them digitally. And we got men and women to then rate these photos for various types of things. And each sort of participant only saw, I think, either the made-up photos or the not made-up ones. So participants had no sort of obvious cue that makeup is what we were manipulating. But when we looked at the results, what we saw is that on the whole, men did not find makeup more attractive than no makeup. In fact, they found it to be less attractive. Women on the whole found it to be more attractive. But there's this one group of men, a sort of a subset of men, if you like, who actually did find makeup to be more attractive. And that was the men who rated themselves as being very, very high on mate value. And the reason why that's really interesting is because it speaks to that principle, which I think is kind of a fundamental principle of female competition, which is the idea that a tremendous part of female competition is individuals who are high mate value, high social status, have access to a lot of resources, effectively burning themselves in the hope that them doing that will cause others to do it, but others will bear a bigger cost than they will. So female intersexual competition it's a little bit like, I guess it's a little bit like the peacock's tail. So peacocks have giant tails, partly because it shows that they're parasite-free. But another big part of it is that it's a massive handicap, right? If you've got this great big tail and you've got to get away from the predators, the jaguars, whoever it is that tends to eat the peacocks. I don't think it's jaguars. I think that's the wrong continent. Anywho, the fact that a male peacock is alive and has this massive tail means that he must be pretty good at escaping, because all else being equal, a similarly looking male peacock but with a smaller tail has not had to work so hard just to survive. So all other things being equal, the guy with the bigger tail must be more robust, stronger, fitter, whatever you would expect, or at least has had to be in order to make it to this point, right? And that basic principle, that's handicap principle, I think is a huge driver of most of female intersexual competition. So getting back to the makeup, you really attractive women, they're wearing this makeup that men do not find attractive. Like on balance, men would just prefer women to not be wearing it on balance, right? Women think it looks more attractive. That's a pretty clear sex difference for the most part. But in men, it's moderated by their own self-report mate value. The alpha males, who of course are the men that these really highly attractive, high social ranking, highly influential women are looking to impress, they actually like the makeup. So these women at the top who are encouraging all of these makeup fads for everyone beneath them to wear, they're not actually even bearing a cost. The men they're not interested in, who are lower down the hierarchy, don't like it, but they don't like those men. So that the opinion of those men is irrelevant to them. So in that particular instance, you've sort of got a situation where the elite women are doing something that for the majority of men would bear an attractiveness cost for them. They're very attractive anyway, so they're probably going to still be fine. The people below them then have to follow these fashions and these trends, and that imposes a cost on all the men who are trying to chase those women. So now we've got this asymmetrical cost. But then the last piece of the puzzle is that the really attractive men have come to the party and gone, you know what, I don't mind it. You want to wear all that makeup, you go for it. It doesn't bother me. I'm fine, right? And so you've just now got this situation where the highly attractive women can do something which for everyone else imposes a cost, and for them it doesn't even impose a cost. So,
and why doesn't the average man find the makeup attractive?
I think it's because there's a couple of reasons. One could be related to all of this social signaling stuff. So men, as a general rule, don't tend to find a lot of the things that women do as part of intersexual competitiveness attractive. And I think a big part of that is because intersexual competitiveness correlates reasonably strongly with the dark tetrad, with all four traits of the dark tetrad. So women engaging in any sort of indicator of intersexual competitiveness, whether it's dolling themselves up all the time, generally being aggressive with other women, always causing drama in the girls' group, whatever it might be. I think men are generally put off by all that because it's a little bit of a red flag that she's potentially not going to make a great mother, just because people that are high on the tetrad tend not to do that. So there's that personality indicator. When it comes specifically to makeup, though, I think there's probably another explanation that's relevant, and that is that when women are wearing makeup, they're covering stuff, and the face is an extremely, high information source of rating someone. And so effectively, if you're covering that up, then you're depriving men of the ability to make the kinds of mate value judgments and mating choices that they would otherwise make, right? So you're just degrading the information signal, and men would prefer to be able to see what they're looking at, and to be able to make that without the information being impeded. So I think that both things are probably playing something of a role there for men and makeup.
Unless the woman is so attractive that the diminishing of the signal, you still know that she's obviously extremely attractive.
Exactly, that's right. And as I said, those high mate value men don't appear to exhibit that same dislike of makeup anyway. So they actually appear to be quite fine with it. Whether that's because they think someone is attractive enough anyway, so who cares, or whether it's because if they're going to go for these high mate value, elite, socially influential women, then they're going to have to like some of these behaviours, because that's what their women are going to be doing. And so it would sort of be not in their interest to be sort of put off so much by them. So I don't think, if I remember correctly, I'm not sure that those men necessarily preferred the makeup, but they didn't dislike it anyway. It didn't make those women look any less attractive to those men.
Okay. And earlier you said something like the fundamental principle of female intrasexual competition is something like a peacock's tail, that it's that willingness to absorb some cost. Why is all of this happening in the first place? Why is it different between men and women?
Okay, so there's a fundamental difference between men and women that I think explains the differences in intrasexual competition. So most people understand already the reason why societies send men off to war. Right, not only are they better adapted to fight, but from the terms of that society then recovering its population, right, women are the rate limiting factor on reproducing. So you can send a large proportion of a generation of men off to a war, and you can ostensibly recover those numbers as a society within like a generation if you keep all of your women and just enough men, right? I'm not saying that this doesn't have, substantial costs, but there's obviously a massive asymmetry there. If any given society decided to do the opposite and send all of its women away, then they're not going to recover their population near as quickly, right? So, and that fundamental asymmetry is the same logic as to why female and male intrasexual competition is so different. When men compete with each other, it's much more like, in terms of intrasexual competition, it's much more like a running race. So, men tend to stay in their own lane, look forwards, run as hard and as fast as they can, and try to get the prize, right? They don't spend a lot of time worrying about what their competitors in the other lane are doing. And the reason for that is that in the reproductive payoff of worrying about what your competitors are doing just wouldn't be there for men. So the reproductive payoff is your own reproductive success compared against the background population reproductive success. It's not just your own. It's your own compared against the population background reproductive success. That's critical, because
reproductive success is relative because of the long-term goal of having your genes be a broader chunk of the whole rather than just absolute numbers, correct?
Exactly, 100%. Okay. That's right. That is right. What is relative matter? So populations can grow, populations can shrink, but the lineages that are winning the evolutionary game at any point in time are those that have a, more than their fair share representation in the next generation, whether the overall population is growing or shrinking. They're the lineages that are going to get selected for. So yes, reproductive success is relative. Now, men are not going to be able to do anything about the background reproductive rate by sabotaging rivals, unless they're going to go around and sabotage, huge numbers of rivals and try to impact that background reproductive rate. It's not going to be of any benefit to them. If they could sabotage a particular rival in such a way that they could then steal some of that rival's reproductive success, that's different. That could be a gain because that's now going to add on to their column. But if we're talking about trying to get a gain just by changing that denominator, the overall background reproductive success, that's not something that is in the control of men. But that is something that is in the control of women. So if women can, and because they are in fact the rate setters of reproductive success, every individual woman that you knock out of the race has a marginal impact on background reproductive rate. Whether you steal the reproduction she would have had or not, ultimately that background reproductive rate is going to drop. And so when you've got large numbers of women trying to kick large numbers of other women out, you end up with measurable effects. And so the payoff matrix for men and women in terms of sabotaging others is very, very different. They're under, I would say, most circumstances, isn't really a payoff matrix there for men. It is not really going to pay. However, under a much broader set of circumstances, it is going to pay for women to do that. So if men are engaging in like a sprint race in terms of their intrasexual competition, then the equivalent female sprint race is a whole bunch of women not going anywhere, fighting with each other at the starting line, trying to hold everybody else back. Right? That's the female equivalent. Women put much more effort into sabotaging other women's mate value, mating efforts, reproductive output, mothering, etc., than men do.
And let's talk about that payoff matrix just to be clear. So for men, the way that works is if, say, you're in a tribe and you were to kill 10 of the men around you, that doesn't really make a difference because other men could still one man could impregnate 10 women. The way the numbers work are just different.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Whereas if you're a woman in a tribe and you sabotage one woman, that's a whole set of potential reproduction that's just stopped.
That's right. That has just it's just been knocked out. It's not going to get replayed. If we assume that the women in the population are reproducing at whatever is capacity, like whatever is the most they're able to handle given whatever the current circumstances are, resources, support, availability, then if you knock someone out, other women are not going to fill in and take that reproductive success. It's just going to be lost. And so women knocking each other out can have a measurable effect on that denominator, the background reproductive rate. And that's what drives female sabotage of other women, other relationships and things like that, which is why you see that much more in women than what you see in men.
Okay. And this denominator, that's the relative success issue. That's your percentage of the whole of reproduction.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So if this is correlated with dark triad and it's genetic, then we would see more and more of these successful, highly competitive women having more and more kids, and the population of women would grow more competitive over time?
Yes, to some extent, but there's also, like I said, men don't tend to like female intrasexual competition.
Yeah.
And so there is obviously counter selection pressure. So everything comes with a trade-off. So there are all the selection pressures that would favor women engaging in these types of behavior. But at the same time, there are counter selection pressures coming from male mate choice that curb a lot of this behavior. So this is one of the reasons why female behavior tends to be quite much worse when there are not men around. So, women do not do, women's reputations is done a lot of harm if men are seeing this kind of super nasty sort of behavior. So that sort of, I guess, drives that perception, at least, that women are much more catty when it's just a group of women than when it's a mixed sex group, because there's a lot of reputation damage to be done because men do not find this type of behavior typically appealing. So that's like the counter selection that in some senses keeps it in check.
Mm-hmm. Now, if men don't do this sort of thing, say, as much, there's a phenomenon called mate guarding, where men are sort of keeping track of, several mates. How does that play into what you're talking about?
So mate guarding, when you're sort of, guarding your own mate, and then mate poaching when you're seeking to steal other mates, that's a little bit different, because that's not about whether or not you can impact the overall population background rate of reproduction. That's actually one individual attempting to sort of steal the reproductive success of another person, which again is something that men are able to do more effectively than women. Because the other asymmetry that I sort of didn't mention is that male potential, at least, is for far more offspring than female potential. So women can reach the maximum on the numerator, how many children you can have, and depending on their age and their circumstances, there may be nothing they can do to change that. They may have 2 or they may have 3, and that may be the end of the road for them. And the only way they can continue to improve their relative reproductive success is to turn their attention to the denominator, the background reproductive rate. Men have always got the option, potentially, if they try hard enough, if they're lucky enough, if to increase the numerator, really, no matter what, right? That never disappears. So it pays men, pays much more for men to be putting their efforts into that numerator, right? It has potentially a much higher ceiling. Obviously, in reality, it only has a very high ceiling for a relative minority of men, but the potential is still there. So it pays, much more for men to focus on maximizing that numerator, and it pays for women to focus on minimizing the denominator. That's the other asymmetry as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Dani, we've talked about hair and makeup both as signals to men and as signals of aggression to women. Why signal the aggression to women? Why not just be sort of crafty?
So women are crafty, certainly. That happens as well. But threats and intimidation is a huge part of manipulating female behavior. So women are very effective at using relational aggression. So that's when you attempt to basically sort of destroy someone's reputation, or isolate them from the social group, ostracize them. Something to do with sort of social relationships. You sort of use aggression in that sense to sort of ruin someone socially in some way or another. Women are very, very good at using those tactics, and women are more so than men, or I'm not sure the difference is huge, but more so than men are susceptible to those tactics as well. So women are incredibly fearful of being kicked out of the social group, of becoming the target of the mean girl. So when you've got someone who is strutting around and being really intimidating, it's an unusual woman that goes, no, I'm not intimidated by that, and I'm not stepping out of your way. The majority of women will just step out of your way. So a lot of this signaling to other women, a lot of this sort of what women do perceive as intimidating behavior, dressing yourself up, being quite, wearing sexually revealing clothing, lots of makeup. Women do perceive these as intimidating, especially when done by someone that they perceive to be, as attractive or more attractive than them. And they get out of the way. And so these types of intimidating signals, in some senses, they are, just like men will use posturing as a proxy for actually fighting, these signals are a proxy for women then not having to engage in the relational aggression. So you can give way to the woman who's saying, get out of my way, or you can risk being her target for the next 3 or 4 weeks. And so this kind of signaling intimidation between women means that you don't have to do as much relational aggression. And of course, the relational aggression, the spreading of gossip, the things like that, women don't necessarily want to do that, because yes, it might harm rivals, and that's a positive in the sort of gains column, but it's going to harm your own reputation as well. Like, other women are not going to trust you if you're constantly spreading gossip, or even not even spreading gossip that's untrue, but just revealing secrets, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're going to incur trust. Obviously, again, if the men see it, men are not generally up for that drama. So there is a cost to engaging in that behavior. If you can stop it from happening just by being an intimidating presence, then you're able to still effectively dominate, and you don't have to take the risks of actually having to aggress against other women.
Dani, you are opening my eyes to so many things. It's amazing.
Many people say that, and not just men either.
Uh-huh.
So many women just go, oh my God, it's true.
Yeah, I'm sure. And if you've been blindsided by something like this in the past, and then it all clicks together. Oof. Have you ever been ballroom dancing or salsa dancing or something like that?
No, I haven't.
So in environments like that, it can be very primal, and you can, now I'm looking back and I can see this play out. I can see who's overdressed and what does that mean? And then, okay, well, nobody's going to compete with her when she wants her space or when she wants to dance with somebody,
Yes.
things like that. And a lot of the reason I do these interviews about manipulation is that I was very close with a very manipulative psychopathic man. And he collects women. And then what he does is he sort of makes competition among them. And,
Yes.
they will compete to be his favorite. And then what he's also doing is there's a progression where they tend to dress and do makeup and hair more and more in the image of his desire. But what this also does is it makes them look like an intimidating little set as well. Like they become the mean girls that people don't want to mess with. And he sort of manipulates and controls a set of mean girls. He has them as sort of this weapon to point, and he can spread rumors through them and things like that. It's quite amazing to think about it now in the lens of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's actually fascinating. I haven't really thought that much about a male managing to actually succeed as position himself as effectively the head mean girl, because what you've just described is that's how most head mean girls, like the queen bee, that's how they tend to behave. They collect a bunch of women around them, not for sexual romantic reasons, typically, more so just for sort of social alliance reasons. But they do exactly what you described. They collect a bunch of women around them. They work to somehow cleave the relationships between those individual women. So they're always fighting with each other, but no one's ever fighting with the mean girl. So this is person not talking to that person, and that person's not talking to that person, but somehow they're always all talking to the mean girl, always talking to the head mean girl. And they all get very competitive, which means that they all start engaging in all of these really intimidating behaviors. And I've never explicitly seen myself or even paid much heed to the possibility of a man getting himself in charge of a posse like that. I've seen plenty of women do it. That's just classic head mean girl behavior. I've not heard of a man doing it before. That is fascinating. I mean, it's not fascinating, it's awful, but it's fascinating.
Yes. Well, as I was reading your work and preparing for this too, I was thinking more about the mean girl dynamic within this. And what he does is he makes them compete, but then about every 6 months, he sort of lets a new leader rise among them who he pairs with. And I was wondering, how does that work, and how does he keep this influence? And we're going to talk about we have been talking about how this all relates to reproduction too. And I was like, what are the common traits of the one that he picks? And I realized that the one that he picks, it maybe it's just coincidence, but always is divorced and already has children. And so it would seem that for her, to the reproductive thing that we're going to talk about more, now she could say, I already have kids, and now I'm just slowing the others. I don't need to necessarily push forward in the same way as I can just hold back this group around me. I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah. So there's two perspectives in there. One is her. And I suspect that's one motive, definitely. But I suspect that this gentleman you're talking about, if he's able to do this, that he either has resources or at least has convinced these women that he has resources. I'm assuming he's wealthy, right?
What he does is he can get them lots of free things because, typical narcissistic psychopath, he's very good on social media and things. So he collects people. He's a con artist. So he cons people into things where they owe him favors. And then all of a sudden he'll meet some new girl, and within a week he'll say, well, don't worry, I've got a trip planned to Miami and I've already got a room for you. And my friend is going to get us this free pass to this thing and stuff like that. So he's always spending money on them. I don't know if he's particularly well off, but he's certainly covering things. And he targets women 20 years his junior who don't have as many resources as he has.
Yeah, that's right. So he doesn't necessarily have resources of his own, but he's good at procuring them at just the high enough rate to make it look like they're going to keep coming.
I believe so.
Yeah. Interesting. So from her perspective, so from the perspective of sort of the women in this group and hoping to be the one that gets chosen at some point, my guess is that, part of it is definitely competitive, but I imagine a big part of it is this promise of wealth and resources, and this no doubt probably incredibly optimistic notion that if they are good enough, they may be able to be the one that can actually get into his heart, get into his affection, and then that's going to put an end to this behavior, right? And if they perceive that the payoff matrix, for, like, obviously this would be a quite risky strategy because they're investing a lot. They know they've got a number of direct competitors. They know that this guy is not especially trustworthy and is not necessarily showing, many signs of monogamy. But the perceived reward is potentially large enough. And again, for women who already have children, they're at a huge disadvantage in the regular mating market, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because for the majority of men, what you see when you meet someone who already has children is, instantly that's a tremendous amount of investment that you're going to have to make in reproductive output that's not yours, right? And that's something that for very obvious reasons, men are psychologically very sensitive to, right? So men are very aversive because of the risk of cuckolding. Men are very aversive to any sort of suggestion, and so that it's not necessarily a deal breaker at all times, but it is definitely a massive disadvantage. So you've got women who are perhaps in a situation where they think, look, the odds of me actually sort of getting a partner on the mating market who's going to have a tremendous amount of resources that he's going to want to pour into me and someone else's kids is pretty low. So engaging in this kind of a high risk, potentially high reward, but probably no reward game might be, they think that's not necessarily them consciously, but their brain has decided this is my best bet. Yes, the odds are not great, but the odds are not great anywhere. And at least if I succeed here, that the payoff is going to be awesome. Of course, his, manipulativeness and dishonesty means that the perceived payoff is actually not going to be there, because I suspect your suspicions that he doesn't have that much of his own wealth is probably correct. He's just very good at making it look that way. So that's the position from their perspective. But then there's also the position from his perspective. And it's interesting that he's choosing women that already have children, because it may well be that he sees that as a good prospect for someone who will raise someone else's children. Because if these are single women who've already got children that some other guy is no longer, some of these fathers are no longer, are not necessarily absent. I'm not suggesting that. They're probably, present, paying child support, see their kids, whatever. Like, I don't know what that situation is. But at the very least, they're not there 24/7,
Mm-hmm.
committed to these women. And so if you're going to have a mating strategy that is sort of short term, where you're effectively hoping to not really invest anything in the parenting, you just want to try and get women pregnant, well, choosing women who've shown themselves to be capable of raising kids on their own is a good choice.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, this lens that you have is making some things add up and raising a lot of new questions. And while we're in this topic of dance circles and things too, the hair thing. Now I'm thinking about the difference between ballet and something like the social dancing that I was talking about earlier. In ballet, the bun is required, and the ballerina is to look sort of ethereal and virginal and sort of afloat on the stage, whereas in other dances, it's meant to be more sexy, more woman, more adult, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it always is presented as a practical thing in ballet, that it's about, well, you won't want your hair in your face, it's for training, but that it means so much more.
Oh yeah, it means a lot more.
Yeah.
Everything means a lot more. One of my central messages, I guess, is that everything is a signal. Even when you don't think what you're doing is a social signal, it's a social signal. So everything needs to be interpreted on like at least two levels, right? There's what you're actually doing and the reasons why you think you're doing it, and then there's the reasons that you're actually doing it, and that's true for almost everything. Everything is a signal of some kind.
And do all women do this stuff? I mean, you're saying everything is a signal. Is everything a signal for every woman?
Look, I think yes, because you can't escape the selection pressure. You can't decide to opt out, right? So everything you do is going to be, the way you present yourself, the way you speak, what you choose to say, what you choose not to say, the clothes you wear, everything sends a signal, whether you are aware of it or not, whether you want to or not. Everything sends a signal out to the people around you that is going to be interpreted by different groups in different ways, but in functional ways. It will have real functional consequences for you. So whether you're aware of it or not, whether you think that's what you're doing, everything is a choice, and everything is going to affect how the humans around you interact with you. Like, you can't decide to make other people not receive what you're doing as a signal just because you don't want them to. Like, you can't, right? This is how humans interact. Everything changes. We can do almost anything to a picture of a person and get a bunch of ratings then about that picture, and you will see systematic, coherent shifts. People interpret, like I said, there's differences, right? High value men don't mind makeup. Everyone else doesn't like it as far as men go, and women generally, on the whole, genuinely think it's an improvement in attractiveness. So, not everyone is the same, but there are clear, coherent patterns there. And so however you present yourself to the outside world, that is going to dictate how other people receive you. You might not want it to. You might not be thinking about it. You might just be, literally shoving on whatever clothes are most convenient to you and not paying heed to it. But you can't stop other people then making those implicit judgments about you. And you can't stop yourself making those implicit judgments about others. Like, many women, will tell me that they don't, they don't know that they didn't know that men liked long hair, and they don't even think men do like long hair. I'm like, no, they do, but I don't think they do, and I never think about, I just put my hair up to get it out of the way, and sometimes I don't bother. Okay, sure, you put it up to get out of the way, and sometimes you don't bother. So you're not aware of what your motives are. But what do you think your brain is doing? Do you think your brain is just like sitting idly by while you do your hair? No, of course not. Your brain is making decisions about how you're going to wear your hair that day. And there are reasons for those decisions. You don't have to be aware of them. We're not aware of, like, I don't know, you can't attach an exact percentage to it, but we're not aware of the overwhelming majority of the reasons for why we engage in certain behaviours. It's implicit. We don't think about it consciously. We don't need to be aware of the complex payoff matrix. They exist. We behave in them. Other people respond to it, and you get the outcomes. None of it depends on awareness. No one has to know any of this, right? It's still happening. Like all these other animals that we study these signaling behaviors in, and we can create their payoff matrices, and we can show that when the vole does this, the female vole, right? Voles don't understand payoff matrices. Voles don't understand fashions and trends and social signaling, but we can explain how all of that happens. And for some reason, we're a mix of naive enough or arrogant enough to somehow think that, oh, that's not what it feels like is going on inside my head, therefore I'm pretty sure that's not what's happening to me, as we pop our hair up in a lovely bun and put on a nice dress and head out to work. Like, it is what's happening. You cannot opt out of what you are. You can't opt out of biology.
Yeah, so there's so many layers to all of this, and I'm amazed at the abstraction too. Like, in your study, you found that these women weren't ever going to meet the hairdressing client, so to speak, and yet even a woman who they'll never actually compete with in the real world, there's already this sense of competition, even when it's so abstract. Yes. How can that be? Are we just not adapted for the abstractions of the world today?
No, I don't think that's got much to do with it. I mean, that's kind of a separate conversation, but I don't give really a lot of weight at all to any of the arguments in that particular bucket. So the idea that that we live in an environment that's not natural, so biology and evolved psychological dispositions and things are now just all a bit crazy and haywire and not matching the environment, and all sorts of other things like that, that we've got culture and that somehow interferes with it. None of those things, I think, hold any water, and that's kind of a separate conversation that we can have. I forgot what I was going to answer. What was your question? Remind me again.
So then the abstraction, to do it in such an abstract environment where the hairdresser doesn't even meet the client.
Yeah. So, no, I don't think it's to do with today's distractions or any of the other kind of modern explanations that people tend to want to use to just sort of wholesale dismiss evolutionary sort of determinants of human behaviour. In terms of the sort of ever-present intersexual competition, that's exactly what you would expect to happen, right? So you've got the entirety of every species, every individual has been selected for maximum relative reproductive success. And so that doesn't mean that individuals run around being little, reproductive maximizers, because what gets selected for are the mechanisms that produce the most reproductive success the most often, right? So you don't have necessarily perfect concordance, not just in humans, but in any species. You don't necessarily have perfect concordance between the particular mechanisms of an individual and the specific features of the environment that they currently find themselves in. So you don't necessarily get every single behavior, every single decision reflecting some perfect theoretical optimal. That definitely doesn't happen. That's not a human situation. That's just behavior. That's just agent behavior in a complex environment. So not everything is necessarily optimal all the time, but everything happens because of mechanisms that have been selected for because they were most successful most of the time. And so the baseline expectation that you should have is that, at all times, individuals are engaging in the types of behaviors that, on balance, maximize reproductive success, which means that you should expect baseline behavior of women. If a big part of female reproductive success is being able to effectively suppress the reproductive success of others, whether that's through sabotage or whatever your mechanism might be, then you should expect women to be taking every available opportunity to do that. So why would you then why would you predict anything else to some extent? Now, there are counter-selection pressures. Women form these alliances, and if you're not in an alliance with other women, then you're kicked out. You're socially ostracized, and that's bad, and women have to avoid that. So that creates selection pressures to cooperate. But again, why would you expect a hairdresser who has no personal relationship to want to cooperate with the client? You wouldn't. So that only leaves sabotage. And I think what gets missed about intersexual competition in women is that it's not something that happens some of the time on occasion. It is a fundamental organizing principle of female-female interactions. Like every other female is either related to you and thus you have a positive interest in her reproductive success. She's not related to you, which makes her a rival. And if she's a rival, then you've got a complicated set of interactions where she may be able to be an ally, there may be able to be some cooperation there, or there may not. But you cannot opt out of intersexual competition any more than you can opt out of social signaling, right? It is a fundamental organizing principle. And the same thing happens for men. Men are always engaging in intersexual competition. It just looks different, right? It's much more show-offy. It's much more, who's got the bigger muscles, who's got the nicer car, who's got the suavest dress, dress code, not meaning men wearing dresses, you know what I mean, right? It's a fundamental organizing principle, but because so much of male intersexual competition is not directly interactive, it's just competing in that show-off way, you don't necessarily see that same level of just underlying aggression by default between men. Whereas for women, a huge proportion, it's probably the inverse, right? As much as male intersexual competition is individual focused, female intersexual competition is rival focused. And every other woman out there is a rival to some extent. And so it's the fundamental organizing principle of female interactions. Everyone is a rival. With some rivals, you can cooperate, you can compete. With others, you need to be really submissive and just let her go because you don't want to be, you do not want to be the target in front of that. So you just bow out. And other women, you have a relationship with, in which case you have a positive interest in their reproductive success, and so you get genuine kin-selected cooperation. But you can't just imagine a scenario in which it doesn't exist. And that actually was one of the reasons why we set the study up like that. So one of the things that I wanted to look at and demonstrate if in fact it was going to turn out to be true, and it did, is that you get this female competitive behavior in the absence of any mating motive. So you sort of pointed out that it's this sort of hairdresser client situation. They don't know each other. And that's true. But the other thing we made clear to do is there was no men in the study, right? There was no mention of men. There was no mention of mating. There was nothing to prime any kind of a mating motive. And frequently in studies of not just intersexual competition, but anything that we're studying, that psychologists are studying in some sort of a self-report way, we will very frequently deliberately add some kind of context for people. If we want to study, if you want to study mating behavior, you'll add some kind of context. You'll give people a vignette to read that describes something, and you get them to respond, and you try to create, an appropriate context to get them thinking the right way in the hope that will, give you a larger signal in your data of whatever it is that you're trying to measure. We try to create the appropriate context. In this particular study, we deliberately did not have anything remotely related to men or mating or partnerships or families or anything, because the whole point of it, there was a few points we wanted to make with these findings. But one of the main ones is that this is just a fundamental factor of female-female interactions. You don't need men around. You don't need mating motives. You don't need women to be thinking particularly about rivals or anything. It's just the baseline of what happens. And that's got some pretty serious implications.
Yeah. And we'll have to talk about the implications. Just to kind of round that out. So sabotage is the norm. It's not the outlier. And so it would actually be more strange if the hairdresser were cooperative.
Exactly. That's right. So you've got sabotage is the norm, just like seeking to impress mates should be the norm. And caring for your children and loving your children should be the norm. Now, all of those come with exceptions. All of those come with complications. But yeah, in the absence of any of those explicit complications or things that would moderate the situation, you should expect that to be like your starting point.
Okay. So, Dani, we've talked a lot about how female intrasexual competition hurts other women. I've heard you talk about how branding men and masculinity as toxic is female intrasexual competition. How does that work?
So I think there's two things going on, or two sort of main separate arms of the explanation. The first one, I think, is where it started, and that, I think, is just corruption of female mate preferences. So corruption of rivals' mate preferences. So, I'm sure many people have heard me say this before, but I'll say it again. The entirety of feminism is a female reproductive suppression strategy. That is its key outcome, and that is the one thing that unites all of its various branches, which in many cases look otherwise very contradictory. What unites them is that ultimately they are hostile to female reproductive success. And
could we just stay on that for just a second? I'm sorry to interrupt.
No.
So there are so many forms of feminism, and I think one of the critiques of feminism is that it never seems to agree that there's this type and that type. And you're saying that you can find one clear point of agreement on reproductive suppression.
Exactly. And the reason why there are so many different branches of feminism and they don't agree is because feminism, rather than being what it purports to be, some, movement to improve the welfare and happiness and freedom of women, it is a reproductive suppression strategy. It ostensibly harms women. Now, when an ideology starts spreading through society that harms women, a lot of women notice. And so what you've got is feminism just being this sort of constantly fracturing ideology. As it appeals to a lot of women and it begins to take hold, then it begins to harm a lot of women, and a whole bunch of women go, hang on a minute, I don't like this bit. And then they start their own little bit of feminism that they go, no, we're not going to do that. I don't like that. That's actually harming me more than it's harming everyone else on average. So I'm not in favor of that bit. And we get a split, and then we get another split. So I think the intersectional feminists versus the radical feminists or the TERFs is kind of the very obvious example of that, right? So you've got the intersectional feminists embracing gender ideology, which, it harms men as well. I don't want to suggest that it doesn't, but it absolutely harms women. And you've got it being pushed by the intersectional feminists. You've got it being pushed in all of the institutions that are dominated by women. You've got women showing like overwhelmingly larger support for gender ideology compared to men in like large-scale demographic surveys, in spite of what certain feminists will tell you, that gender ideology is being pushed by perverted men. Don't get me wrong, there are perverted men with autogynephilia who fucking can't believe their luck. All of a sudden they become society's, most sacred individuals. Like, that wasn't on the bingo card. These guys don't have the social capital and the social wherewithal to be pushing an ideology like this, right? They are just the unbelievable beneficiaries of the most mental thing we've all seen in a while, right? But it's being pushed by women. You cannot, right? You cannot get around that fact. That the one time that men had an opportunity to demonstrate how they feel about it was the whole Bud Light scandal, right? Feminists told men to stay in their lane. Well, that was in their lane, and men made very clear what their response was. But, Dylan Mulvaney, wasn't he like he did something, well, I'll probably say the wrong athletic brand name, so I won't say one, but he did some spread for some big athletic brand. And there was a few women that jumped up and down, but that athletic brand sales did not tank the way Bud Light sales tanked, right? Like, it was not equivalent. Men on the whole just went, no, and women just went, no, yes, no, we don't know. Right, and so you've got this absolutely being pushed by women because it harms women and children. Well, specifically, it harms, female reproductive success in a big way. And so then you've got a whole bunch of women going, actually, hang on a minute, this is, look, we're not on board with this. So now you've got this separate group of feminists who are just as on board with other things that do harm women, or at least harm women's reproductive success. Those two things are kind of the same, but they're not always the same. They're on board with many other things that suppress reproductive success, but not this particular one, because this one is harming them too much. And that's why feminism keeps fracturing, because it's just a war of women. And so, women cannot declare a war on women and not expect large groups of other women to occasionally go, hang on a minute, we're going to fight back on that. And so the different sort of waves of feminism are all about, what is going to be most sort of, hostile to female reproductive success in the here and now. So as the political environment changes and the sort of social environment changes, feminism comes up with new ways to be hostile to women's reproductive success. And so this is where we see the beginnings of the men are bad movement. So, right from the earliest sort of feminist writings, there's plenty of signals through there that, that men are bad, right from the sort of most extreme versions of women who were feminists who were suggesting that, I won't even try to remember the names because it's not my strong card, but, there's a quite famous quote of one suggesting that, we needed to keep the male population to a maximum of 10%. And, right through to the less extreme sort of rhetoric, which is, less about just, effectively trying to keep men as some form of minority livestock. The less of sort of extreme forms, which is just, marriage is a form of oppression and, motherhood is a form of oppression. And so, we've had this, anti-male rhetoric feeding through, and we've seen it become more and more intense in recent years, to the point where we've now got this notion of toxic masculinity being thrown around, and even to the point where it's become so mainstream and so accepted that, like, I don't know what's going on in this regard in various parts of your part of the world, but certainly here and in the UK, there's now programs being introduced in primary and secondary schools to effectively teach boys not to be toxic. So it's reached enough of a critical mass, this idea, that effectively, boys and men left uneducated will just naturally develop into toxic men, and we somehow need to do active work with our young boys and men to re-educate them to prevent that. That's an extraordinarily extreme view that has managed to creep its way in bit by bit and become rather mainstream, and it does not alarm nearly enough people enough. It's like the frog in the lukewarm water, that you slowly increase the temperature and the frog doesn't notice that he's, he eventually doesn't notice he's boiling. It's crept in to the point where we have a just extraordinary approach now to young boys, because of this toxic masculinity. In terms of getting back to why this is, again, it's driven by feminism and it's driven by by women, because what it is attacking all of the aspects of men that make them good husbands and good fathers and good protectors and good providers. So what started off as demonizing those parts of men that women actually should be looking for in a partner, to corrupt female mate choice and to encourage women to make suboptimal choices, and to encourage women, instead of what you should see as like a green flag in a prospective partner, was teaching women to see those as red flags. So again, a corruption of female mate choice. And it's now run to the point where men are actually being effectively, I'm trying to sort of think of the word, like kind of being shut down, if you like. You know, we are now actually talking about, in a really incredibly dystopian sense, you know, introducing some sort of formal education for boys that teaches them basically that they can't be masculine at all. Which of course is profoundly awful for the individual boys and profoundly grim in terms of looking forward for the rest of society as well. You cannot have a functioning society without strong masculine men, and a lot of them, which is kind of which is sort of the end game of all of this nonsense, is a very non-functioning society.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the end game and population, but let's take this kind of from macro down to micro. I think we've gone from macro, okay, this is branding men in general as toxic, has this effect. In the medium level, also, you know, and like down to the individual, down to boys in school and things like that. Let's take it to the micro. If a woman were to say, get dumped by her boyfriend, and then she tells her friends, oh, he's toxic. This is actually a manipulation to slow down those women from getting with this man?
Possibly, but I'm not sure that it necessarily is a targeted thing to stop them from getting at that men, because there's reasonably strong deterrence for that anyway. So, you know, unless you are pretty happy to see the end of those female friendships, women are not going to go after their close allies, ex-partners anyway. I mean, that is not to say that it doesn't happen. It certainly does happen, but it generally comes with the end of the friendship. So it's kind of an end game in and of itself. But I think what's happening more there in those scenarios is what you get those women collectively just all reinforcing with each other that he was toxic, he was the problem, and you're better off without him, and just reinforcing these notions of singledom. Now, there might be some circumstances in which that's ostensibly true, right? But maybe, you know, we might be talking about a scenario where a woman was in an incredibly unhealthy relationship and frankly she is better off without him. But the issue that we're seeing is that what's being branded as toxic behaviour is not toxic behaviour at all. And this is the problem, right? Men who are respectful, chivalrous, protective, who sort of loyal, to show their wife honour. These are the types of behaviours that are now being branded as toxic. You know, even down to the tedious and the minuscule, like, you know, if he opens the door for you, that's a sign of, you know, benevolent sexism. And, you know, it might seem nice, but it still means that he's sexist. He's still going to want to oppress you. It's just, you know, what it's done. Well, it's done a few things. It's turned male green flags into red flags. So the things that women should actually have been looking for to make sure they took high quality partners, they are now actually are being points that are turned off. That's like number one. But the other thing that has happened with the demonization of all of these sort of supposedly gendered and sexist behaviors is it's completely destroyed human courtship ritual. Right. Yeah. What all of these individual sort of courtesies did is they provided a really clear set of rules for how men and women who didn't know each other could behave around each other. And those, you know, a man who didn't open the door for you was sending a very clear signal that he wasn't interested, because that's a little bit rude. And some men, of course, would open the door always just out of just out of politeness. But, you know, it's I was having it's kind of a separate conversation, but it's sort of the same thing. I was talking with someone else, a friend of mine, about the importance of manners, and saying that the importance of manners is really, really underestimated, because what you can do if you have impeccable manners, right, all the time, and that's just how you behave and how you conduct yourself. And this is true, I think, whether you're a man or a woman, right? If you have impeccable manners, that means that you can be a little bit less polite. You're still being really polite, but you're just being a little bit less polite than you normally are. And that sends a very clear signal to someone that you're not happy with them, or you're not interested in them, or whatever it might be. You don't have to behave aggressively to do that. If your baseline level of operating is not especially polite, then you've actually got to be really quite aggressive if you want to kind of send someone a signal that you're not happy with them, right? You can't just be a little bit less polite than you normally are, right? You've set yourself you set yourself a really low floor now if you don't ever sort of engage in the extra effort of those social airs and graces. And it's a similar thing now with the courtship rituals. The courtship rituals gave people things that they could do or not do that set very clear signals of, yes, I'm interested, or no, I'm not, without ever having to directly be rude or socially awkward or aggressive. Now that that's been obliterated, because almost all of those signals have been branded as sexist, now not only do you get tremendous miscommunication, but people have got to be impossibly obvious and direct and uncouth and aggressive just to get their point across. And even then, their partner frequently has no idea what message they're trying to send. So the attack on masculinity and many positive male behaviours has completely corrupted female mate choice and female mate preferences, but it's also been an attack on the male courtship ritual, right? Men now don't have any courtship rules they can follow, because all the rules they used to have been branded sexist, and they're not allowed to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's just made a social environment that is now very hostile to people pairing up instead of conducive to people pairing up. Which is just one of many, many reasons why I say that feminism is an attack on, female reproductive success. Everything that feminism does, in any given situation, in any given case study, is take whatever environments that it is in, and it makes that environment more hostile to reproductive success. That's just what it does every single time. That is its only unifying theme.
Yeah. Yeah, it leaves everyone confused, men and women. I was out with a buddy of mine recently, and I told him, I think that girl likes you. And he said, I don't know. And then a week later, as we're walking out, she kind of pulls him aside, and she's just exasperated. And she just says, hey, do you want to hang out one-on-one or not? and the poor girl, she'd been sending him signals, but it's hard to read. It's all so subtle, and there's no shared language. So everybody's just kind of on this uneven footing.
You know what else there is too? There's no shared language, but what's also now been introduced is the fear of punishment.
Yeah.
So not only is there no shared language and confusion, but it's no longer just embarrassment that men have to fear if they approach a woman and she's not interested and they've misread the signals. It's no longer just, well, this is awkward, I'm very sorry, and I'll just show myself out. There's now the risk of genuine, in extreme cases, there's risks of legal punishment, but at the very least, there are genuine risks of social punishment. If you approach the wrong woman, she will tell people how sexist you are, how aggressive you were, what you tried to do. It's not just that, no one really knows what to do, and so everyone's confused. There are also, again, it's created this massively asymmetric payoff matrix for men, where the potential cost, which I suspect is, your friend may not have known whether she was interested or not. Now, in the absence of the risks of punishment, he might have taken that risk and gone, well, look, the worst that can happen is I'm wrong and I'll be a bit embarrassed and whatever. But that's not actually the worst that can happen now, right? That much, much worse can happen from men behaving in what would otherwise be considered by the overwhelming majority of people to be a completely innocuous and totally appropriate and benign interaction, will be turned into, something that can destroy his reputation now.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of, that's the nastier side of completely disrupting and destroying these sort of this shared language and this understood courtship ritual, right? You've now introduced, you've destroyed it. You've made it so that no one really knows what to do and no one really agrees on what's appropriate and what's not. And then in that kind of environment, you now just introduce this incredibly blunt punishment tool. And so, men are just like, well, the payoff's not worth it. Unless I can have complete certainty, I'm not going to do it. And of course, men can never have complete certainty because aside from anything else, women won't give it. That's not how female courtship works, right? And so men waiting for certainty will be waiting forever.
Yeah. So just to round out this sort of micro level look at it. So when women brand men as toxic, when they denigrate men on a local small level, that may not necessarily be a manipulation of their friends to keep them away from that man, because friends won't necessarily go for that man anyway. But manipulating the friends, sabotaging the friends by just generally making them afraid of men and wanting to stay away from men.
And making them afraid of good men.
Of good men, strong men, aggressive men, men who have these sort of classically masculine characteristics.
Men who will protect you, men who will look after you, making women wary of those men.
Protectors. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's all part of the sabotage that is the norm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Dr. Dani Sulikowski, before we get to our last topic, where's the best place for people to look for you online?
Oh, easy. That's X. So at Dr. Dani S on X. Everything I do anywhere else is on X as well. So
okay. Great. We'll put links in the description for people to check out. And last of all, let's talk about population. We had talked a little bit before we started recording about things that we've seen in the changes in birth rates, decline in birth rates. What do you think that is, and how does it relate to your work?
So what I think is happening is the inevitable result of this sort of increased intensity of female intrasexual competition and reproductive suppression. So because so much of intrasexual competition is geared towards sabotage anyway, much of it involves reproductive suppression either directly or indirectly. And what we're seeing now is because of the levels of hostility towards men, because of the destruction of the courtship rituals, because of the scandalization of courtship as well. So, and again, it's not just the scandalization of courtship. That's one thing that we've all sort of seen in the workplace. But at the same time, what you're seeing is, I guess, if you like, the de-scandalization of things that should be sexual scandals. So, a male colleague interested in you and attempting to, flirt with you or test the water or whatever can be completely inappropriate workplace behavior, and he's obviously entirely toxic. But women going out on Saturday night and having sex with, a different man every Saturday night, that's girl boss behavior, and that's perfectly fine. So obviously, therefore, if that's perfectly fine behavior, then doesn't it follow from that what those men are doing is perfectly fine? So yeah, respectfully approaching a colleague at work because you're interested in them and want to know if maybe they might be interested in you, that's scandalous. But having random sex with people you don't know, that's perfectly fine. That's okay. And while you're drunk, it's all good. It's all part of being young. Anyway, so what we're seeing is an environment that is just completely hostile to reproductive success. It's hostile to the formation of long-term partnerships. It's very conducive to short-term sexual behavior, which can certainly produce children, but tends not to, especially in an environment that comes with pretty readily available contraception and the like, and certainly readily available abortion is the other one. But it's either way, even if it produces pregnancies, it does not tend to lead to excellent reproductive success. So there is definitely a quality difference between the output from children that you get in a stable pair bond relationship versus children that are had. And that's like one of the, most well-known findings, any kind of outcome measure you want to measure for the ultimate well-being and life success of those children. It's just like a world between if they're single mum families versus parent families. So what we see is an environment that is just increasingly hostile to reproductive success, specifically female reproductive success. But that's not the only thing that's happening. So yes, that's going to see the birth rate decline, right? It's harder to couple up. It's the world is not laid out to support families anymore. The world is laid out for people who have a double income but no kids. That's the economic unit that can survive in the world, where many of us live. But there's a couple of other things going on at the same time. One is the attack on men, which I sort of said initially when you asked me about that. I said there's kind of two main arms, and then I explained one arm. The other arm is one arm is the corruption of female mate preferences. The other arm is actually the emasculation of men in society. That's the other arm of it. So now what we've got is an emasculation of men. We've got declining birth rates. And then the third phenomenon that we're seeing is what Helen Andrews called the feminization of the institutions. And so what we're seeing there is women who are, because of a declining birth rate and an environment that's incredibly hostile to reproduction, we are seeing many, many women investing many more hours in non-motherhood activities, so typically in their careers, but also just in general civic life, investing many more hours in that. Now, there's a very obvious mathematical trade-off there. If the sex that is the sort of rate-limiting sex of your population chooses to invest huge amounts of time in something other than reproduction, then reproductive rates are going to fall. That's unavoidable, right? That's just, you can't get around the maths of that. But obviously, that's not the only reason that reproductive rates are falling. As we've talked about, there's all these other aspects of our current society that are hostile to reproduction, hostile to long-term relationships, hostile to families, and hostile to women investing in motherhood. So it's not just a consequence of, women started working, so of course the birth rate has to go down. It's not that simple. There's a complex system playing out. And so you've got women disinvesting in reproduction and motherhood. You've got men being emasculated, which is bad news for any society. And then the third arm is you have got the institutions effectively being dismantled from within. And the people who are dismantling them from within are the women. So Helen Andrews laid out I'm not 100% on the same page as her in terms of some of the underlying sort of psychology that she was attributing female behaviour to, but that's kind of a side issue. She did a tremendous job of laying out the impacts that women are having in institutions as soon as they reach some sort of critical mass. She was suggesting that critical mass was like 50% employment. I think you need less. I don't think women, the changes that women bring into these workplaces that end up effectively just gutting the institutions from the inside are not brought in using democratic means. And if they were, you would need more than 50% of women, because not all women are on board with these types of changes, right? It is a minority of women that are driving these types of changes. But again, because women are very, very averse to the risks of relational aggression, many women will go along with them and not push back. However, whether it's 50% or something lower, women in these institutions reach some sort of critical mass, and the institutions begin to shut themselves down. They stop prioritizing outcomes, performance, and merit, and they start prioritizing things that are unrelated to performance, outcome, and merit. Some people call them feelings and social cohesion. I'm not sure if you've ever been in a female-dominated workplace. They're not nice. People's feelings are not being prioritised. That may be the story that they tell under the banner of DEI, but that's a story we tell. That's not actually an accurate description of what's going on in those workplaces. So that's what is actually going on in terms of the nitty-gritty is another big conversation, but the outcomes of it are exactly as Helen Andrews described, which is that they become less productive, they become more bloated, they whatever it is that they're meant to be doing becomes extraordinarily biased. So when we're talking about courts of law, the value of evidence degrades, the value of the legal decisions degrades, they become ideologically motivated. When you're talking about universities, academic freedom degrades, diversity of opinion degrades, the merit of the argument becomes less important, and it all becomes ideologically aligned. We're seeing it in politics, we're seeing it in media, we're seeing it in hospitals. We're seeing it in all of the load-bearing institutions that support our civilization. So it's not, like, my argument is not that we have a simple birth rate decline and that's going to lead to the effective collapse of civilization. What we've actually got is quite a complex system with different components that are all working coherently to bring civilization down. And when I see a number of different components all working together coherently to bring civilization down, then, you're not looking at something crashing and burning. You're looking at something being systematically dismantled and packed up. So there has to be an explanation for why that would happen. It's not an accident. It's not just a confluence of a number of unfortunate things coming together. It's a system that is doing this for a reason and serving a purpose. And the reason that I've come up with goes back to relative reproductive success. So if you imagine reproductive success as being like a really grim game of musical chairs, right? When you've got a population where we're starting to see birth rates declining, right? So you've now got each generation, there's not enough chairs, right? And so every generation, some lineages fall out. The ones that are left have got, therefore, just by definition, a larger share of the proportion of representation in that generation. And so every round of musical chairs that happens, the individuals who are left there in that generation have got a bigger and bigger share of the prize, right? It's like those lottery games that you sort of on game shows sometimes on TV where, they get down to where all the players will have to share the prize at the end, and they might start with like 100 players. And as you get down to 9 players, 8 players, 6 players. As you get down to fewer and fewer players, they'll each get a bigger share. And at some point, the players can agree to stop playing to get down to one winner. And they'll go, look, if I'm going to get a third of this prize, us 3 are all happy. Yeah, we're not going to play. We're just going to split the prize 3 ways. The same thing happens reproductively with these lineages. As the population shrinks, your share of the remainder population is huge, but you're in an environment that is incredibly hostile to reproductive success, and the number of chairs in every generation is going to be smaller and smaller. So at the moment, you've made it towards nearly the end. You're nearly a winner. So, you're now very motivated to have someone call the end of the game so that you are here at the end and are not one of the lineages that gets knocked out right before the game ends. So as we reach this end, you actually see the emergent behavior that comes from people is actually hastening on the end, because the end is the big genetic prize, which is that population shrinks, it goes down to a bottleneck, but civilizations die. People often don't. I mean, many individuals die, but the population then gets invaded or gets subsumed.
Yeah.
And it explodes, right? That's the genetic prize. You might be one of 100,000 lineages to begin with. If that population shrinks down to only a few thousand lineages, and you're one of those, and then explodes again, right? Your lineages has gone from a tiny representation to a tremendous representation in the next population. And because the next population came from the people who brought this on, and initiate it and made it happen, those genes are what then explodes, and everyone else is now playing the same game of musical chairs. You don't realize you're playing it at the beginning. No one's noticed. It's because there's billions of chairs. But eventually there'll be fewer and fewer chairs, and we'll do it again. And this is why civilization does not look like it's falling. Well, I mean, it looks like it's falling, but it's being dismantled, right? Governments, institutions, universities, the media, as collectives, are all behaving in ways that are exacerbating the problem and promoting it. They're not behaving in ways that are halting it or recognizing it or turning it around. They're all sort of cooperating. And I think this is why what's happening for a lot of people looks like some giant conspiracy theory, right? It looks like, there must be some overarching, puppet masters that are doing all of this because all these things are going to bring on the collapse of society, and they're all in favor of them, and it's mental and it's insane. But you don't need that puppet master to explain what's happening. This is just these behaviours are just the emergent properties of this type of reproductive system. When you start to get down to a few lineages, those lineages want to bring on the end of the game to make sure that they're still there at the end, right? They want it, they want the game to end while they're still in it. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing our society pick itself up and pack itself up and go home, so that all the ones that are still here now will be the beginning of whatever comes next.
So what looks like the Illuminati could be the consequences of the incentives of female sexual competition.
And male sexual competition. So
let's talk. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the thing, right? Because you might think, and this is part of why, I think this is why it's so important for this system to work in this way, that men are being emasculated, right? Because masculine men won't let this happen.
Yeah.
Right. Masculine men won't let this happen. And in fact, we can see in different parts of the world where this is becoming, more and more obvious to individual people, we are seeing masculine men begin to self-organize and try to resist this. And you're seeing plenty of women join those groups as well. It's not just the men. Like masculine men will not sit by and watch this happen, which is why in order for this kind of a system to function in this way, men have to become emasculated so that you don't have enough men left to defend the civilization. You have to have men who are not prepared to do that in order to let this happen. But what often gets missed in these sort of discussions about female mating strategy and male mating strategy, and this strategy works best for men and this strategy works best for women, and women do this and men do that. There's a really important principle, and that is that every single child born is the child of a mother and a father, right? Reproductive success is by definition shared 50% across men and women. So there cannot be a strategy that on the whole is better for women than it is for men. Because if women are getting reproductive success, an exactly equal number of men are getting that same reproductive success. Now, there might be a particular strategy that is good for a particular man that might be bad for the particular women he is interacting with, but that still, if that's going to produce offspring, there will be women who will be the mothers of those offspring. So when we've got women saying that, female manipulative reproductive suppression is driving this, well, that's because female reproduction is much easier to suppress than men. If a system like this is going to emerge, it's going to be the women that are going to have to be responsible for the reproductive suppression, because that's a much easier pathway to it. So yes, women are engaging in reproductive suppression, but these lineages that are remaining at the end, they have as much male representation as female representation, if you like, right?
Well, do they? Because one man could have children with many women. So, I mean, there are men who are serial monogamous. They'll have a marriage when they're young, they'll have a marriage in middle age, they'll have a marriage when they're older, and each time they'll have several kids. So it seems that it could be more skewed.
But it's only skewed within men. It can't ever be skewed between women and men.
But
right?
there are always both.
In men, that's right. But it cannot be skewed. It cannot be skewed. If we're sort of setting up a system and saying, well, it's driven by women because women's reproductive success and it's relative and they can suppress others. So these lineages that are left at the end, right, these lineages are male and female. Now, it may only be, and often is, depending on the way, civilizations clash, and then also looking at the genetics of it, it is likely that it is going to be many more of the women that carry, like, if you like, the old gene pool forward. But it is the genes that belong to men and women. Like, when you're thinking evolutionarily, you need to step back even from the individual and just start thinking about the genes and the lineages. The individuals is just the body that carries those genes for a while, right? The genes are playing this game over multiple generations. So the genes don't, care too much if all the copies of them in men have to effectively, be sacrificed in order to preserve the copies of them in women. That's absolutely fine. And so from an overall perspective, what you're seeing largely is men being sort of turned into a type of man that won't resist this in order to facilitate the system. And that's that's where the men are ostensibly, as cooperative in the takedown of these institutions and whatnot as women are. You need to have that critical mass of women in the institutions for these things to happen. These things don't happen when they're male-dominated workplaces. But when you do get that critical mass of women and these things begin to happen, you don't see the men standing up en masse and revolting and stopping it. They go along with it and they help and they cooperate. So it really is a coherent system where all the players in it are, with the exception of a minority, the majority of the players in it are, behaving in such a way as to bring on this bottleneck, to bring on the collapse and to bring on the explosion for as long as they still exist in the population.
Wow. Well, Dani, it seems like we're just getting warmed up, but just one last thing. I'd like to know, for men who are sort of waking up to all of this, seeing all this happening, and are confused and playing catch up, what advice would you have for them? Because there are a lot of men who want to have kids, who want to reproduce, and maybe don't realize the landscape that they're in. So
there's a lot of men that want that. There's a lot of women that want that too, right? So remember what I said before about, when women get into the institutions, it's not 50-50. First of all, because I think it's less than that. I think you need fewer than 50% women for these changes to begin to appear. But they're not democratic. Because women are so adverse to relational aggression and work really hard to avoid it, women will very much go along with things. And you see that with the various ideologies and the fads, right? Women going along with the pronouns and the whatever. And then when it's all over and they're no longer at risk of getting in trouble anymore, they're like, I was never really into that. And the thing is, some will be lying and memory holding that they were like one of the drivers of it in their workplace and they were the one going around getting other people in trouble for not using the right words or whatever. But the majority are actually telling the truth. The majority were never in on it, but they behave that way because that is a much more peaceful way to live than to attempt to push back against that stuff, right? And so you see a lot of women behaving in these really sort of hostile ways, whether it's hostile to men or hostile to the idea of families or hostile to the idea of having children. You see a lot of that. Much of it is a mirage. So, there are a lot of men and a lot of women out there who actually are individually motivated to want families and to want, kids and everything that goes with that in a reasonably traditional sense. And so I would say to both men and women who are not kind of so caught up in this that they think everything I'm saying is just absolute utter nonsense. I would say, you just got to make an effort to find those people because they are there. It doesn't look like they're there, right? Women are very good when they push an ideology at creating a consensus, right? Women are very scared, and I know because I can see the looks that I get when I say some of this stuff, and I can see the disbelief that I would be, it's not bravery. I can tell you that. I'm not an especially brave person. That's not why I'm prepared to say all these anti-feminist things. I'm not quite sure what the correct adjective is, but I can assure you it's not bravery. But nevertheless, I've had a lot of people say, I can't believe that you're saying this stuff. You are so brave to actually come out and say this because, women, it's the thing with feminism, right, is it's the mother of all ideologies, right? Gender ideology captured a lot of people, didn't capture everyone. Some people pushed back against it. It's now, beginning to run its course, although I will say, I'll remind everyone, not in Australia yet. We are still where, the Northern Hemisphere was, 5 to 10 years ago. So have some pity on me. But it's running its course in other parts of the world, and it will here as well, and it'll die away and whatever. And, we see the same thing with other types of fads. For a while, the whole kind of, fat phobia and your fat shaming, and that was a massive thing, and now that's a bit less of a thing, right? All these things all kind of wax and wane. But what most people, I think, don't appreciate because they are very much in it and thus don't realize they're in it is that feminism is just one of these ideologies. But the way you can tell is that people know what it is they're not allowed to say. If it wasn't one of those heavily policed ideologies, people would be perfectly happy to have these free conversations about stuff and it wouldn't become so instantly heated. People would not be intrinsically scared to say anything anti-feminist. There would not be this really heavy policing on dissenters to shut up and to stop talking, right? So it is one of those, but it is so ingrained. Like all these other things are just little extreme offshoots of it. The mother is actually feminism. And so many people are so ingrained with the idea, even if they can see some of its negative outcomes and they agree it does this and they agree it does that and they agree it's gone too far and they can see its excesses, even those people are acutely uncomfortable and in some senses unwilling to actually say, oh, but I'm not a feminist. They'll actually say, oh, I am a feminist though. And you almost see it like a ritual in the conversations. Look, I'm a feminist. I'm all in favor of, this, and this. And now here's all the issues I can see with it. But I know I'm not allowed to say that unless I first pledge my allegiance to the ideology. Like feminism is the mother of all of these, right? And the majority of people are in it, and when you're outside of it, you can see the people that are sucked in by the gender ideology, right? And when you're outside of these things, you can see you can see the critical race theory and you can see the pro-Pally clowns and you can see all of that, right? You can see how ridiculous Queers for Palestine is when you're not in Queers for Palestine, right? But when you're inside it, it doesn't feel ridiculous. It doesn't seem ridiculous. It seems perfectly reasonable. And it is very, very reassuring that people think, oh, yeah, no, I'm a feminist. I'm a good man. I'm a good person. I'm a good woman. I'm definitely a feminist. You're not. Many people are not. Many people, like you don't actually agree with many of the things that feminism is espousing in all its various contradictions. What you are is in a position where if you don't say that, you're going to be socially policed. And so you say it. And the difference between feminism and some of these other sort of more extreme, less mainstream ideologies is that a larger number of people can see that these are just mind viruses. The overwhelming majority of people genuinely don't believe that feminism is a mind virus. It is. It's just like the others, but it's just taken hold of so many more people. And like anyone in any of them, people who are sucked in by it don't recognize it. But they do all the same behaviours as the people in the others. They pledge their allegiance before they dare criticise it. There are certain things they know they're not allowed to say, even if they can't explain why it would be so bad. They just know that you're not supposed to say it. And they respond with, agog and with awe at someone who's willing to say that stuff as though it's breaking some sort of sacred covenant that we've all agreed never to break. So I would say to men and women who are interested in having children and families, there are many more of you than you think there are, right? The idea that you are in a tiny minority is itself an illusion and is itself, having the effect of making people not try, because you are in a society that is incredibly hostile to reproduction. And so, every part of it is gearing you towards not bothering, not trying and giving up. But much of that is an illusion that that can be broken if you actually try. So you need to find like-minded other people, and then you need to live your life the way you want to live your life, recognizing that you are in a society that is structured in such a way as to be very hostile to reproduction. But a lot of the individuals within it are not actually, are not necessarily psychologically and certainly consciously on board with that idea. You can find other people. There are loads of us, probably even the majority. It's just that we're currently stuck in a situation that makes it look like everyone is not like that.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, harder to couple up is a thing. And we talked a little bit before we started recording about the work of Stephen J. Shaw, and I'll put his episode in the description as well for people to check out. But a very similar idea here. So thank you, Dr. Dani Sulikowski, for putting this all together. You said that maybe it's not bravery, but to do the research, come to the conclusions, and to speak the conclusions, even when there's pushback. That's certainly very integrated. And I'm very grateful to you for doing that and for taking this interview with me. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Anytime.